You want a career in clinical medicine, but you also want to do cutting edge research and maybe teach. You're thinking about an MD PhD program, but what does it take to get in? Let's find out. Our guest today is former chairperson of the University of Arizona's College of Medicine Admissions Committee.
Welcome to Admission Straight Talk, the podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. Your host is Accepted's founder and world-renowned admissions guru, Linda Abraham. At Accepted, our mission is to get you to that unforgettable moment when you read your acceptance email and shout, "Yes, I'm in!" Confident you'll be attending the perfect program to help you launch the career of your dreams.
Welcome to the 453rd episode of Admission Straight Talk. Thanks for tuning in. Do you want to get accepted to medical school this cycle? We have a webinar that's just perfect for you. You're invited to start medical school in 2023, How to Get Accepted This Year, which is coming to a Zoom screen near you on Tuesday, January 18th at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. You can reserve your seat at accepted.com/startmedschool. No spaces, no dashes, just accepted.com/startmedschool. Our guest today is Dr. Herman, aka Flash Gordon, Accepted Consultant and former chair of the University of Arizona Tucson College of Medicine's Admissions Committee. Dr. Gordon also served on PhD admissions committees while at the University of Arizona, and since joining Accepted has guided clients to acceptance at MD PhD programs, sometimes to several acceptances at those programs. Dr. Gordon has been on Admission Straight Talk several times in the past, and it's my distinct pleasure to have him on again today. Flash, welcome to Admission Straight Talk.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you again for joining me. Now, let's go back. We're going to focus this show on MD, PhD admissions, as you know. How and when did you get involved, first of all, in med school admissions, and then specifically the MD, PhD world?
Let's see. I think I started on the University of Arizona Admissions Committee about a decade ago. And it was one of these things that's like, oh, it's your turn to take on a big service job. And I knew nothing about what I was getting into. Although I was teaching med students, it was interesting. I very quickly learned that it was actually a great committee, and that for everyone who was on it, they felt like it was the best service they had ever done.
Wow.
And it's because, it's a major responsibility. You're determining people's futures. You're shaping the class that you're going to teach. It's just a great opportunity, and you're doing positive things. It's not like a disciplinary committee or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like being an obstetrician. When you get to deliver babies, you don't just deal with sickness. Okay.
Right.
How long were you the chair of the committee, and roughly how many applications did you evaluate in that period?
Well, so let's see, I was committee for 4 years, and I was chair for the last 2 years. And at the committee level, about 600 applications make it through the interview and then go on to the full committee. So that's 600 a year, of which, as chair, you have to look at all of those. But when you're on a subcommittee, or at least we ran it with subcommittees, then you get about a fifth of those. So, 120 or so. And it's a lot of work. It's, for a typical admissions committee member, it's about 200 hours,
Well,
which is a lot.
yeah, it is, especially on top of a teaching load.
Right. And then as chair, it's probably closer to 600.
Right. So you've obviously
it's really huge.
Hundreds of applications.
Right. And although I had done PhD admissions in neuroscience, I was new to how the MD PhD admissions worked. And different schools do it differently. At University of Arizona, there was a separate MD PhD committee, and both that committee and the regular MD committee had to accept the applicant.
Yeah.
So it was a sort of parallel process. In some schools, the MD PhD committee has more autonomy. It's like, okay, you get this many slots and you get to fill them however you want.
Got it.
But there is a very large component of, both sides have to accept you. They have to accept you as a clinician, and they have to accept you as a researcher. So.
Okay. Are there different kinds of MD PhD programs? And if so, what are some of the major categories?
I think the biggest distinction is whether it has an MSTP or not. And the MSTP is an NIH-funded program that basically pays for so many students to be in an MD PhD program each year.
Is that
So
a
that's
full ride?
yeah, so that's what gets you the full ride, right? And at least while you're in the doing your research component, you're getting a stipend as well as having your tuition paid.
Wow.
So, you're acting as a graduate student during that time. So now there are other programs which don't have an MSTP. They all aspire to having an MSTP because it's a load of money and it allows you to attract the best students. But still, there are a lot of programs which are excellent, which maybe they're newer or smaller, and so they haven't gotten to the point where they can get one of these coveted MSTP grants. But they'll try to fund their students, or at least some of their students, in a similar way. So as you come in as an MD PhD student, it is sort of, the free ride. I don't know that I would call that much work a free ride, but
It is a lot of work. But it is
but it is
better
good.
than paying tuition and doing a lot of work.
Yes, yes. So, I think a lot of my MD PhD clients, they're only applying to MSTP programs.
Sure.
But there are opportunities outside of that, which can be very good MD PhD opportunities nonetheless. So.
Would those non-MSTP programs typically also provide at least some funding in order to compete?
Typically, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's the only way they can compete. Yeah.
Right. Who, in your opinion, should consider the MD PhD, whether it's MSTP or non-MSTP?
People who are very motivated.
To do what?
To do a lot of work.
Okay.
So, it's a long haul.
Typically, how long?
Well, typically 8 years, because it's the full 4 years of med school. And, and 4 years for a PhD is quick. But, to a certain extent, you can use some of your rotation times in med school and somewhere between first and second years to be getting going on your research. So there's a little bit of overlap, but not a whole lot. So back to who should consider it. I find that even the successful MD PhD clients tend towards one side or the other, towards the clinical side, but they want to do research to support their clinical work, or probably more frequent, they're more on the research side, but they want the total involvement of being able to apply their research to the patients that they're working with. So oftentimes, like a rare disease
Right.
might have, an MD, PhD specializing in it. So they're treating the patients, and in working with the patients, they're also figuring out, what are the concerns. Maybe there are symptoms that people aren't really that aware of, but as you work with these patients, you start to realize it, and then that becomes a research topic.
Sure.
And then you also see the results of your research being applied to the patients, and hopefully with positive results. But then you get feedback from the patients. So that kind of deep interaction can be very successful on both sides, both on the research side and on the clinical side.
So it's kind of a combination of theoretical and clinical.
Right,
practical.
and application, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I usually think of medicine as an applied science. And so an MD PhD is doing both sides. They're figuring out, the underpinnings that can then be applied. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Once a student decides that he or she wants to pursue the MD PhD program, what should they consider as they go about the task of selecting where to apply? How should they research the programs? What factors, in your opinion, should be determinative?
So,
Or at least influential. How about
right.
that?
So people who are applying for the MD PhD have to have a lot of research experience, and that will include probably at least 2 publications. So that's
Do
pretty.
they have to be first author, or they just have to be an author?
Uh, first three would be good.
Okay, I'll take it.
And they probably have about 2,000 hours of research experience before they're applying for the MD PhD.
That almost is it's a full-time role for a year, really.
Right. Yeah. So, they probably have spent 3 summers in labs, and they've been getting credit for continuing to work in the lab throughout the year. They may be spending at least 15 hours a week every week in school, and then 60 hours a week in the summer, and it adds up, and before you know
Yeah.
it, there's your 2,000 hours. So it's people who have demonstrated a very serious commitment to research, and if you and everybody who's getting selected has that kind of background. So it's not like you can say, oh, I'd like to do research in addition to my MD. If that's the case, you don't want to go down the MD PhD path. There will be plenty of opportunities to do research as an MD. And, there are special programs almost all med schools have where they pay you for the summer between first and second years to do 8 weeks of research. And that can lead to sort of ongoing opportunities throughout the rest of your medical education. And some of those people end up being very significant clinician scientists, even without the PhD. So
I have a brother-in-law who was got an MD and worked as a physician for many, many years, but did research throughout the time and was published many times, presented the whole thing. But never got the PhD. Never. I don't think even ever considered it.
Right, and I think that works very well for a lot of people, and the NIH supports clinician scientists whether they only have an MD or they have an MD PhD.
Okay, but going back to my question, in terms of, let's say somebody has determined they want the MD PhD. And they're now like, how do I choose where to apply?
Oftentimes people get really into their undergraduate research, and that helps to shape what they want to get into as a research field. And so they'll know, the kind of labs that are doing the work that they'd like to get into.
So that would be one of the factors.
Right. So that's actually a great opportunity that you should leverage in your application. So contact the lab, and maybe you've already been in communication with the lab. Maybe the lab you've been working in, has a collaboration with this other lab. And it's like, oh yeah, I'd love to go to this lab at UCSF and work on this other aspect of the research. Maybe it's moving, from cell culture to an animal model, but related diseases. There can be very good reasons for kind of wanting to develop your research career at a particular location. So that's sort of the best case scenario, right? Now, oftentimes, you just apply to places because the stats and the reputation are appropriate to what you're looking for, and that can work out too. But I find that the closer your connection, the better your chances are of getting that interview from that school. So,
all right, great point. Thank you. Now, MD, PhD applicants have to write, in addition to the typical MCAS application, the typical secondaries, they have to write an MD, PhD essay and a significant research experience essay. Can you tell us kind of what's the difference between those two documents and the MCAS personal statement, or the typical secondaries? How long are they? When should they be submitted? And what is the purpose of each one? There's a whole bunch of questions there, so I can go back over them. So why don't we just start with what are those two documents?
So when you're, you sign up for AMCAS, usually it opens a month before the first possible submission date. And you click a button that says, MD, PhD. Then 2 things become available to you: the MD, PhD essay and the significant research essay. Otherwise, the AMCAS is the same. So let's see. So what's different? The
And
personal.
do those two essays have to be submitted at the same time as the MCAS?
Yes, yes, it's part of your application. So those essays have to be there loaded in AMCAS when you click the submit button. So the regular personal statements, 5,300 characters, you can talk about your desire to do research in that personal statement. You don't have to, but you do have to put it in the MD PhD essay. So the MD PhD essay is 3,000 characters, so it's relatively short, say about 3 paragraphs. And it is absolutely crucial, and it's probably the hardest one for MD PhD applicants to write. And the goal of this essay is to express why you need both degrees. I would say my clients work 3 weeks on it. It's not 3 weeks solid, but
Right.
you have to go through many versions and kind of rethinking it. And they'll start out, sort of knowing at some level that they want to be a clinician scientist, but they haven't really kind of got it to the point where they can communicate that to somebody else. Obviously there's the whole bench to bedside part of this, right? Where you want to be able to take the work that you've been doing and, deliver it to the patient, and it does happen, but not necessarily. There are physician scientists too, who, they're working on stuff in the lab that's still very far removed from what's going to happen with their present day patients.
Or it doesn't work.
Right. In which case you're screwed, because the American system does not reward failure,
Okay.
even though it should be an essential part of science. So there's a lot of discussion about this, right? Of how the NIH should be maintaining failure. Okay, so somehow you need to be able to express that.
And do you have to give like specific reasons or goals or?
Right. So as always with the AMCAS, stories, vignettes really help, because you can say, it's like a picture is worth 1,000 words. A little vignette is worth a lot of essay. And so I have a successful MD PhD client this year who, was simultaneously working in the ED where there were lots of COVID patients, and working in the lab on how COVID might be affecting the brain, and trying to work out the mechanism of that. And so that's incredible. It's like you're on both sides of the fight at the same time. And so she was able to include that as part of her essay, and part of her motivation to keep doing this kind of work. So
right. All right. And
okay, so then significant
ahead.
research is very similar to what you would write for a PhD committee. So it's 10,000 characters. It should be like a 1-paragraph summary right at the beginning, sort of, your path, what your interests are, where that came from, and, sort of how that's developed. Then you go through and have sections for each of the labs or each of the research projects that you've worked on. And ideally, so I find, because this is such a long essay, it works to have little titles. So the title is the lab, the dates you were there, the PI, right, and the research topic. And you talk about what you did, not getting too into the technical details, but getting into the question. Why was this important? How did your research fit into the larger scheme of things? And then at the end, some sort of conclusion. We were able to determine this, or it didn't work because. And if I were to do this, if I were to have continued on this project, I would have tried pursuing this other approach. Something like that. And then ideally, you've got like a publication at the end. It could be just a poster. That's fine. But it's a reviewed journal article. That's great. And so that's the end of the section. Then the next section, title, the time period. This is what I did. This is why it was important, and so you go through and you squeeze all of that into 10,000 characters. And for somebody who's done their 2,000 hours of research time, the challenge is squeezing it in. It's not filling out the 10,000.
And is there any attempt to include like a proposed research or no? It's just strictly what you've done in the past or to date.
Right. You can, you could have a final paragraph of, this pathway has led me to a desire to be involved in this new kind of research.
Got it.
Maybe
so if I were to summarize, the MD PhD essay would be more like a why I want to do this, kind of what's motivating me to pursue this particular path. And the significant research experience essay would be exactly what the title implies, mostly focused on significant research that you've done in the past with the details that you mentioned. The question that you're trying to answer with the research, right? Okay. And obviously the personal statement, the regular personal statement in MCAS and the experiences, most meaningful experiences, activity descriptions, they would probably present the clinical side of you, if you will.
It should still be a mix, right? Okay. So, so you've got 3 most significant essays, and it's probably be your most significant clinical, your most significant research, and your most significant community service. So
nice.
Just like a regular MD application, right?
Right. Okay, great. And it kind of leads to my next question, which is, what are some of the critical differences between the regular MD application and the MD PhD admission in terms of how the application is evaluated? We've been talking about different elements and kind of how they fit together. And I think you gave some excellent advice, but how are they evaluated differently?
Okay, so some schools at the AMCAS level, it's at the AMCAS level, allow you to choose whether you want to be considered for both the MD and the MD PhD programs. Typically, the MD PhD program is the more competitive one. And the idea is, well, if you don't make it into the MD PhD, would you still consider being accepted into the MD program? And, again, they still have research opportunities as an MD. And occasionally people, it's just so obvious that they're going to be good researchers, especially after their first summer of research. And so sometimes they'll get picked up for the MD PhD program. So that happens. It's not frequent, but I have seen it happen. So there are reasons, even if you want to be a very serious, clinical researcher, for you to accept an MD program. Okay, so that's the first step is, are you being considered by both programs? I would say most schools, there's always a separate MD PhD committee. It's not the regular MD committee that determines the MD PhDs. So there's a separate committee. They're typically both MDs, all 3, MDs, PhDs, and MD PhDs on that admissions committee. So that committee will evaluate more the research side. So it's almost like a PhD review. But in addition, they will ask, it's like, well, why do you need both degrees? Because we could just take you into our PhD program. Why do you need to go through this dual pathway? And then on the MD side, if you check the box for being willing to consider as an MD, they'll put you through the regular MD process. And if you come out of this with acceptances by both committees, then you're an accepted MD PhD. It does happen sometimes, and I had to negotiate this as chair, where the MD PhD committee would pick somebody that the MD committee really didn't want.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they said, so the MD side was like, it's not clear that this person really wants to be a clinician. And so there had to be some negotiating about that and what you end up offering to the student. So it does happen both ways, so it's one or the other committee will accept. Ideally, both committees accept.
Did it ever happen that a student was steered to just straight PhD?
Yeah, so that gets a little complicated. So if a student applies to multiple PhD programs at a campus, those programs will talk to each other,
Sure.
and they'll all do a pre-review, and they'll decide where that student would have the best fit. So they'll say, oh, well, this student should be in biochemistry. So then the rest of the process continues for that application going through the biochemistry department only. It's not like that can happen with the MD PhD. So they'll have to reject a client and tell the client, we'd love to have you as a PhD student.
And then they have to reapply the next cycle?
Right, have to reapply the next cycle.
Got it. Okay.
And maybe they got accepted somewhere else. So
yeah. So I guess just on a really high level, in regular MD admissions, the committee is looking to see, is this person going to be a good clinician? Are they going to be a good fit in our community? And the MD PhD committee, they're still looking for all that, but they're also looking for this research science element. I mean, it has to be obviously fairly significant, because otherwise they could be an MD and still be a scientist and a researcher, et cetera. So
Right.
there has to be a more significant commitment. How do you recommend applicants kind of avoid the twin traps, which we've danced around, I think, a little bit in our conversation, of having an application reader question why they need both degrees? Why not just do the MD or just do the PhD? I mean, it seems like it's almost a little bit of a dance that they're having to do.
They do. It's funny because we have, the students go through this whole process and, articulate themselves. And in the end, from the admissions standpoint, you can just read it, and in one pass, you can know this person is an MD PhD, right? You can
Really?
just feel it, right?
Okay.
You feel the passion on both sides. Right. So it's not like there's any trick or any code word that they're using. It's just the big picture. You just see it. This person has to do this. They're just so driven. And you pick those up from the letters of reference as well. It's like, oh, this person, frequently, if I happen to come in at 10 o'clock at night, there they were in the lab. That's what you want to read on the committee side.
And obviously, in terms of the clinical side, you want to still see the kind of drive and commitment that you would see
Right.
for any MD.
Right. And, what's always great on the clinical side is that sort of one-on-one caring for people. And
Right.
if you have a witness who can attest to that in a letter, that goes really far.
Now, what if you have somebody, a client, okay, who, let's say, had some rough spots academically? Maybe in the first couple of years of college, they had a rough adjustment. They kind of got their act together in their junior and senior year. And they got into research, and maybe they took a gap year or two and they researched and they got really good clinical exposure. But, the GPA is what their GPA is. Do you have any advice for that kind of person who really would like the MD PhD? They have that passion.
Yes, and they can be successful getting into MSTP programs.
All right.
And I think it comes from the PhD side. About 10 years ago, there was a study done on the successful biology PhDs. So this included biochem, micro, everything that's related to biology. And what they found was that the metrics coming out of college were very bad predictors of successful scientists.
Really?
They'd get people who, they were good with books and stuff. They were terrible in the lab. They just, they didn't like the day-to-day grind, and or they weren't creative. They liked all the book stuff. Who knows what the problem was? But what turned out to be the best predictor was the letter of reference from their undergraduate research PI.
Whoa.
And, if that said, this person's great, they're a great problem solver, blah, 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 they're on 2 publications, they're instrumental to this project, and this is, the contribution that they made. Yeah, then they're going to be a great PhD candidate. And that works on the MD PhD side as well. So I'd say, for strict PhD, you can take people who really were pretty bad undergraduates and make them into successful scientists. You can't do that for MD PhD. They still have to have their wits together so that they can get through school, right? It's just intense, and you got to keep at it. You got to have all the school skills. But you don't have to have as high a grade. You look on MSAR these days, and the medians are like 3.85 at most schools. It's like, really? It's really high. And I can't believe that there aren't good doctors with GPAs a lot lower than that. So,
well,
but
obviously
that's
averages first of all, I think that's the top schools. I don't think it's, if you go a little bit down.
I actually see that at a lot of state schools.
Really?
I mean, it's just,
it is a little bit nuts. Yeah.
Right. So, but with MD PhDs, I see the GPAs a bit lower, and in part they were in the lab all the time, so they weren't so focused on, oh, I've got to get all A's and stuff. They were like, I got to learn this material, but I got to get back to the lab because my experiments need something done on it. And so I think that there is a certain, I don't want to use the word tolerance, but a knowledge that the GPA is not as essential on the research side. And so then what can happen is the MD committee may say, well, yeah, they've got all the credentials, they're a good researcher, they're good with patients, but their GPA is a little on the low side, right? So then what happens is the 2 committees get together and they negotiate, and usually the MD PhD wins in a case like that.
Really? All right. Yeah. Is there, well, before I get to, I'll ask 2 questions again, which probably is makes it harder for you. But anyways, what role does the Mcat play in MD PhD admissions? And is there a minimum GPA or Mcat? And I'm talking not a stated minimum. I'm talking a realistic minimum that, you got to do something else first to fix if you don't have it when you want to apply.
Right. So MD PhD is really hard to get into. So so there are, so it's very competitive, and there aren't that many slots. So if if it's you and some other candidate who has better metrics, probably the person with the better metrics is going to get the acceptance. But that said, I think the metrics can go a bit lower for MD PhD, and it might be 3.6 GPA and 512 Mcat. That's still, pretty reasonable. Yeah, pretty reasonable metrics. But given the competitiveness, I think you want to at least be at that level. And I've seen with MD PhD, just like with MDs, that the Mcat is all important. And the higher your Mcat, the better your chances are. And I think it's, so this is my 7th year at Accepted. And this is the thing I've really learned working with clients, applying to med school is, the Mcat is the single biggest factor, I'm sorry to say. And the AAMC has been lobbying against it, even though it's their tool.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, 512 and up.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry. That's just the reality.
That's the reality. Well, I appreciate the dose of reality here.
Mm-hmm.
What about MD PhD applicants who didn't make it and are thinking of a reapplication? What should they do if at first they didn't succeed? Should they try again, or try for something else?
Yeah. So MD PhD, just like MD, not making it 1 year does not damn you for a reapplication. But just like MD, you want to figure out what was weak in your previous application and address it in your preparation for the following year. So it could be, and I think it's often the case where, yeah, your clinical experiences just aren't strong enough. You know, sometimes people just sort of go through the motion, you know, they're doing their candy striping in the hospitals, and you know, there's lots of hours, but not a whole lot of real caring for patients. And that's what you need. And actually what it comes down to, it's caring for people as opposed to caring for patients, right? So you can be involved in community activities where you know, you're helping people overcome things. Like maybe it's you're helping people get to their doctor's appointments, right? You know, you're finding people who are in need and you're providing a service. There are all kinds of ways that you can make a direct impact on an individual that helps improve their lives. And that's what they're looking for. So, you know, it's identify what it is that's weak. I'd say if the weakness was in research, you're probably in trouble.
And you go out and get a research position?
Yeah, you can. It's going to take a few years to go through that. So I'd say, you know, the research passion seems to go back further than the clinical passion, in part
Okay.
because you can do research at a younger age. I have a client right now who was very young when she went through college, and she couldn't do clinical jobs because she was too young. And then once she got to the right age, then she could, but that also, you know, put her at a disadvantage in her first cycle of applying. So,
Right. So, but I think you're saying that a rejection doesn't necessarily mean forever rejected.
correct.
If you address the weaknesses in the application.
Right. And sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, it's, you know, you haven't presented yourself effectively.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's, I think, you know, one of our jobs as consultants is
Right.
to really help people figure out how you present yourself. It's like, and I'll do things like, okay, we need a mission statement. You know, I need one sentence about, well, you know, why you need to do what you're trying to do. So, and
Right.
we can spend a week on that. You know, but you really have to achieve that focus. And then once you've got it, like everything else kind of falls into place. And
Yeah.
and I've just seen that enough times that, yes, you know, so sometimes that's all you need, right? Keep doing the good things that you're doing, keep doing the clinical aspects, keep doing the research, but let's get this application straightened out so that, you know, people really understand who you are and why they need to take you. So
Sounds good. You're kind of leading. This is like a perfect lead into my next question. You're a great guest. What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen applicants make in MD, PhD applications, or that you correct?
I'd say one of them is not having the best clinical experiences. You know, they may have some, but they're not that sort of one-on-one type. And I've had, you know, clients who start now or even earlier where I can help them recognize that. And it's like, okay, you need to get this done by May. You know, you need to have 6 months now where you're pursuing this sort of one-on-one experience with somebody. It could be, okay, you're doing too many research projects. You need to focus so you get that publication out of it. So it's just trying to get that priority straight and fix those things, as well as getting that mission statement. And I find sometimes, you know, the mission statement helps to make it clear that, oh, This is what I need to do, right? And then you're off and running. And in the meantime, kind of developing your personal statement, your MD, PhD essay, and those go through multiple iterations as you're getting these new experiences. So,
Right. No, I think these are excellent points. Thank you. Is there anything you would have liked me to ask you in connection with the MD, PhD application?
I guess, what do I typically do with a client?
Go for
So,
it. How do you typically help an MD, PhD applicant?
MD,
I mean,
PhD.
I can think of one off the top of my head. I think he had 9 acceptances or something. This was last year.
Right.
Just yesterday I was corresponding. I don't even think I forwarded this to you, with an applicant who just got into his first choice school. This was an MD, PhD. This was just MD, first choice allopathic med school. Absolutely thrilled. He was a reapplicant. He'd had already 3 acceptances, multiple interview invitations. In the previous year, he had nothing. He had I don't even think he had an interview invitation. So how would you help an MD, PhD applicant?
So there's applicant versus reapplicant. So the applicant, I'm a scientist, and you can throw a lot of science at me and I can appreciate it, right? So I like to learn the science that my clients have been involved in. And then we talk about, the underlying motivations for this science. How do you turn this into, like a 5-minute data blitz or something? How do you turn this into an elevator conversation? So the different levels of how you present what you're doing and what you're interested in, to tell your friends, colleagues, whoever. And
Maybe your mother or grandmother.
right, that too, right. So how do you convey this to a non-scientist, right? How do you justify it to them? So I try to work with what they have to offer, and understand that, and then help them to make that into a compelling story. And then and I typically, with MD, PhDs, I start on the PhD side, and then do a similar sort of approach on the MD side, where, okay, tell me why you need both degrees. And it's got to start there, as opposed to why do you need the MD? It's like, no, why do you need both degrees? Okay, let's work on this. And then that gets back to why you need the MD. And where does this part of the story come from, and how do the two parts come together? And so it evolves over time, but I really enjoy getting to know the science that my clients do. So.
Okay, great. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that insight. Flash, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank you again for sharing your in-depth knowledge and experience with our listeners. And we'll link to resources related to this podcast from accepted.com/453. Those resources will include Dr. Herman Gordon's contact page, his previous podcasts on Mission Straight Talk, and other relevant resources. If you'd like to work with Dr. Gordon on your MD, PhD, your MD, or your PhD applications, please contact us as soon as possible, because he does book up as deadlines approach. And as you can tell from this podcast, he's obviously very, very knowledgeable about the process and has helped many, many applicants get accepted. Listener, thank you too for joining Dr. Herman Gordon and me for Mission Straight Talk's 453rd episode. Again, you can get the show notes at accepted.com/453. Final reminder and a favor. The reminder: don't miss Start Medical School in 2023, How to Get Accepted This Year, which I will present on January 18th. Save your spot today at accepted.com/startmedschool. And the favor: if you find the show worthwhile, please tell a friend about Admission Straight Talk. They'll thank you, and so do I. Thanks again for coming. This is Admission Straight Talk, produced by Accepted, and I'm your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.